When the Second World War reached the jungles of Southeast Asia, the battlefield changed its shape. In Europe and North Africa, armies fought over cities, deserts, and open roads. But in Burma, New Guinea, and the Philippines, the enemy was not only armed men, it was nature itself. The landscape seemed designed to break the will of anyone who entered it. Torrential rains erased paths overnight, turning tracks into rivers of clay. Steep ravines split the terrain into islands of mud. Bamboo forests grew so thick that even light vehicles became useless. Tanks sank to their turrets. Jeeps disappeared in swamps that had not been mapped by any surveyor. For engineers and infantry alike, every mile forward became a small campaign in itself. In this world of green and silence, progress depended on ingenuity more than firepower. The Japanese army had learned to move through the jungle with minimal equipment, using bamboo and rope to create makeshift bridges and ladders. Allied troops, burdened with heavier machines, found themselves trapped by terrain that refused to cooperate. Rivers that looked narrow on a map turned out to be impassable torrents, swollen by monsoon rains. Crossing them required not only strength but coordination, courage, and the ability to improvise. Traditional bridge-building methods, using cranes, trucks, and prefabricated spans, were impossible. There were no roads to bring the machinery in, and even if there had been, the ground could not support their weight. What began as a logistical challenge soon became a test of human adaptability. Soldiers discovered that every step forward demanded a new kind of engineering, one stripped of luxury and scale, focused entirely on survival. The mission was no longer about constructing monumental bridges of steel and concrete. It was about creating something that could be carried on a man's back, assembled in minutes, and withstand the weight of war. The engineers of the British and American armies, trained to think in tons and spans, now had to think in kilograms and minutes. They needed structures that could be disassembled, carried by a handful of men, and reassembled under fire, in mud, with tools that fit in a backpack. The climate added its own cruelty. Wooden beams rotted within days, eaten by moisture and insects. Ropes frayed, bolts rusted, and the air itself felt like an enemy. To survive, the engineers began experimenting with new materials and new forms: steel panels, folding frames, floating pontoons made from rubberized fabric. The idea was simple but radical: to make a bridge light enough for men to carry yet strong enough to bear the weight of vehicles. It was not merely an engineering project, it was a transformation of how armies thought about movement. The bridge would no longer be something static and monumental. It would become a tool of motion, as mobile as the soldiers who depended on it. In those jungles, the line between survival and defeat often lay on the far side of a small stream. A crossing delayed by a few hours could mean an entire unit left exposed to ambush or starvation. The engineers knew that a single bridge, carried in pieces across the mud, could decide the fate of hundreds. Out of necessity, the concept of the portable bridge was born, a structure designed not for cities or highways, but for the chaos of the tropics. It symbolized the moment when human intelligence adapted to a world that refused to yield, proving that even in the most hostile terrain, progress could still be carried on the shoulders of 6 men. The problem faced by Allied forces in the jungles of Southeast Asia was not one of courage or determination, it was one of movement. Armies designed for the open fields of Europe and the deserts of North Africa suddenly found themselves in a world where even walking became a battle. Roads were either non-existent or swallowed by the jungle. What maps marked as trails were often narrow animal paths, overgrown and invisible beneath layers of vines and mud. When the rains came, and in Burma or New Guinea they came almost daily, the ground liquefied. Trucks sank, horses drowned, and supply convoys came to a halt before they ever reached the front lines. The jungle consumed everything that relied on weight and wheels. Infantry columns moved forward by sheer persistence, cutting through undergrowth with machetes, dragging their supplies on improvised sleds or bamboo poles. But even for foot soldiers, progress was measured in meters, not miles. Every stream, no matter how small, became a military obstacle. Most rivers were fast, unpredictable, and deep, with banks too steep to climb. During the monsoon, their levels rose by several meters within hours, washing away makeshift crossings and turning the landscape into a maze of flooded valleys. Traditional bridge building methods failed immediately. The heavy Bailey panels and pontoon components, though revolutionary in design, required trucks to transport them. In regions without roads, they simply could not arrive. Local improvisation offered only temporary solutions. Engineers and soldiers built bridges out of bamboo, rope, and palm trunks, copying methods used by local villagers and Japanese troops. But these fragile structures, soaked by rain and crushed by humidity, lasted only a few days. The fibers of ropes loosened and snapped, nails rusted, and planks swelled until they split. Even the lightest vehicles, such as the Willis Jeep, could destroy such a bridge in one crossing. This forced engineers to rebuild constantly, draining manpower and time. In a war where entire operations depended on maintaining momentum, a single broken bridge could delay an advance by days and expose troops to ambush. The challenge was not limited to combat units. Supply chains, fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, depended entirely on the ability to cross rivers. In the jungle, a failure of logistics was fatal. Isolated units ran out of rations, radio batteries died, and wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. Helicopters were not yet in practical use for transport, and air drops were unreliable under dense canopies. The only solution lay on the ground, in the hands of engineers. They needed a structure that was both transportable and strong, capable of being carried by men on foot through mud and assembled without cranes or power tools. Complicating everything was the climate itself. Wood rotted, steel rusted, and even canvas decayed under the constant assault of moisture and heat. Tropical rivers hid leeches, crocodiles, and debris carried from miles upstream. Nightfall came suddenly, and operations that began at dawn often ended in darkness. Engineers were forced to work waist-deep in water, under monsoon rain, with the constant threat of enemy fire. The Japanese, accustomed to the terrain, exploited the natural defenses of rivers and ravines, turning every crossing into a potential trap. Allied units could not rely on permanent structures. They had to move fast, build quickly, and disappear before being spotted. The lack of mobility shaped the entire strategy of the Burma and New Guinea campaigns. Generals could plan operations, but those plans were only as strong as the roads and bridges beneath them. Without a reliable means to cross rivers, entire divisions were reduced to small, scattered groups struggling through the wilderness. Every delay multiplied the risk of disease, hunger, and morale collapse. Malaria and dysentery claimed more soldiers than bullets. The jungle was not neutral, it actively resisted human movement. Thus, the problem was as much philosophical as logistical: how to build something enduring in a place where nothing endured. The solution had to defy weight, rot, and terrain all at once. Engineers had to imagine bridges not as fixed monuments, but as living tools, light, temporary, and human-sized. What they sought was an entirely new category of structure, a bridge that could be carried, assembled, and trusted to hold under impossible conditions. In the jungles of the Pacific, the survival of an army depended on its ability to turn engineering into endurance. When the war expanded into the jungles of Southeast Asia, Allied military engineering faced a transformation unlike any it had experienced before. Until then, the great innovations in military bridging had come from Europe, where rivers were wide but accessible, roads were solid, and vehicles could approach the water's edge. British and American engineers had mastered the art of constructing massive modular bridges such as the Bailey, capable of carrying tanks across the Rhine or trucks through the ruins of Italy. But in Asia, those same designs became almost useless. The challenge in Burma, Assam, and New Guinea was not to build bridges across grand rivers, but to find a way to cross countless small, unpredictable streams that carved through dense jungle, with no approach roads and no equipment to support the operation. The first lessons came from disaster. In 1942, during the initial British retreat from Burma, hundreds of vehicles and artillery pieces were abandoned because bridges collapsed under monsoon floods. When the Allies regrouped in India the following year, the Royal Engineers began rethinking what a bridge could be. They studied local methods of construction: bamboo rafts, rope spans, suspended walkways, and combined them with Western engineering precision. The result was a new philosophy of mobility, the bridge as a portable instrument rather than a fixed installation. It was a shift from industrial to human scale. Two main approaches emerged. The first focused on infantry assault equipment, light, collapsible systems designed for foot soldiers to carry and assemble without vehicles. Among these, the kapok assault bridge became a standard. Its buoyant sections, made from kapok-filled canvas cylinders and wooden planks, allowed troops to cross narrow rivers rapidly, even under fire. A team of engineers or infantrymen could assemble a span within minutes, anchor it with stakes or ropes, and dismantle it just as quickly. It was light enough to be carried by hand, yet stable enough to move men and small equipment across fast currents. Alongside it, the British developed the folding boat equipment, FB, a versatile system introduced before the war but refined for jungle conditions. Each folding boat, made from wood and canvas, could be carried by a small team and unfolded into a pontoon. When joined together with steel transoms and decking panels, the boats formed a floating bridge strong enough to carry vehicles like jeeps or Bren carriers. The FB allowed Allied troops in Burma to advance where roads had never existed. By the time of the 1944 campaigns, it had become the backbone of river-crossing operations in the Southeast Asian theater. In parallel, American engineers were facing similar challenges in New Guinea and the Philippines. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers adapted their infantry footbridges and light pontoon bridges for use in tropical terrain. These systems used aluminum and steel tubing, wooden decking, and inflatable rubber pontoons that could be packed and carried through dense vegetation. The 91st and 43rd Engineer Battalions, operating in the Pacific, conducted extensive field experiments to determine how few men were needed to carry and launch a bridge under combat conditions. Reports from New Guinea in 1943 described the successful use of portable footbridges assembled by 6-man teams, each section light enough to be lifted onto shoulders and transported through mud. This period marked a turning point in military engineering doctrine. The experience in Asia forced a re-evaluation of priorities. The emphasis shifted from strength to adaptability, from permanence to speed. The idea of the human portable bridge was born out of necessity. European armies had long associated engineering success with grand scale, with cranes, steel beams, and road convoys. In the jungles, scale became a liability. The most valuable equipment was that which could be carried, assembled quickly, and abandoned if needed. The innovations developed in India, Burma, and the Pacific did not remain isolated. They informed a new generation of engineering systems that would later shape both military and civilian responses to crisis. The lightweight assault bridges, kapok floats, and folding pontoons created between 1942 and 1945 represented the fusion of two traditions, Western modular design and Eastern resourcefulness. They were born in the humid valleys of Assam and along the flooded rivers of New Guinea, where necessity turned improvisation into doctrine. Historically, these efforts stood at the intersection of technology and geography. The same war that produced the massive Bailey spans over European rivers also produced, half a world away, the smallest bridges ever designed for combat, bridges that could be carried by 6 men through rain, mud, and jungle. It was a quiet revolution, one that reshaped not just military engineering but the very definition of progress in war, not the power to destroy, but the ability to move forward, one river at a time. The true catalyst in the transformation of military bridging during the Second World War came from a single, elegantly simple idea, that a bridge could be both strong enough for tanks and light enough to be built by hand. That idea took form in 1941, when British civil engineer Donald Bailey, then a modestly ranked officer in the War Office's experimental bridging establishment, presented a new modular design that would change how armies moved forever. Bailey's concept was born not out of luxury or funding, but from necessity. Britain had lost much of its engineering equipment in the evacuation from Dunkirk, and the Royal Engineers needed a bridge that could be built quickly in the field using minimal resources, yet withstand the weight of modern armor. Bailey's design replaced the complexity of earlier systems with a logic of simplicity and repetition. He proposed a modular truss bridge made from prefabricated steel panels, each small enough to be handled manually by a team of 6 men. Each panel weighed around 600 pounds, approximately 270 kilograms, and measured about 10 feet long by 5 feet high. The genius of the design lay in its geometry and method of assembly. Identical panels could be bolted or pinned together in any configuration, forming single, double, or triple truss girders depending on the required strength. No cranes, rivets, or welding were necessary. Everything fit through standardized pins, clamps, and rollers, allowing bridges to be built in the field with basic hand tools and muscle power alone. The War Office quickly recognized the potential of Bailey's prototype. In 1941, trials began at Christchurch, Hampshire, under the supervision of the Royal Engineers. The tests proved extraordinary. Teams of engineers could erect a bridge capable of supporting a 40-ton tank in just a few hours. It could span gaps of more than 60 meters, yet be assembled entirely from components transported on ordinary 3-ton lorries. More importantly, each section could be unloaded and carried by hand when vehicles could go no farther, a feature that made it invaluable in rough terrain, mountain passes, and eventually, jungle warfare. The timing of Bailey's invention was critical. The Allied campaigns in North Africa and later in Burma required rapid mobility. Existing bridge types, like the Inglis and Callender Hamilton, were too heavy and required specialized machinery. The Bailey's modularity offered a universal solution. The same panels used to cross the Rhine in Europe could be carried into the Burmese jungle or the Italian Alps. Its flexibility blurred the line between the grand and the improvised. A handful of soldiers could begin a small footbridge using only a few panels, or entire engineering companies could extend it into a tank-bearing span across a river. By 1942, the Bailey Bridge had entered full production in Britain and Canada. Thousands of sets were shipped around the world, each containing panels, transoms, decking, and pins. The design became the lingua franca of Allied engineering. In the jungles of Burma and New Guinea, where trucks could not approach the riverbanks, soldiers learned to unload the panels far from the site and carry them one by one through mud and brush. The standard operating procedure described 6 men lifting each panel with carrying bars attached through its truss openings, moving in rhythm like porters. Once at the river's edge, the sections were joined into longer frames and pushed across using rollers or rafts as temporary supports. What made the Bailey design so revolutionary was its combination of mechanical logic and human scale. It turned the act of bridge building into something cooperative and rhythmic, a process that relied on coordination rather than heavy machinery. It was, in every sense, an engineer's response to the chaos of war. In Europe, it allowed armies to advance faster than retreating forces could destroy the roads behind them. In Asia, it gave Allied soldiers a tool that functioned even in the absence of infrastructure. The same panels that could hold a Sherman tank over a French river could also be carried, one at a time, through Burmese jungle trails by men soaked in monsoon rain. The catalyst was therefore not only a technological invention but a philosophical one. Bailey had redefined what engineering meant under the conditions of total war. His bridge represented efficiency, adaptability, and trust in the human hand over the machine. It proved that the line between the industrial and the primitive could be bridged, literally, by design. When the first Bailey spans began appearing on the front lines in 1942, they immediately became symbols of movement and momentum. They embodied a new kind of warfare, one in which victory depended not just on firepower, but on the ability to cross whatever stood in the way. The Bailey Bridge was a triumph of modular engineering, a structure born from precise geometry and human practicality. Each of its parts was designed not only to fit perfectly with the others but also to be handled by ordinary soldiers without specialized tools or machinery. The fundamental building block of the system was the Bailey panel, a rectangular steel truss frame roughly 10 feet long and 5 feet high, weighing about 600 pounds, 270 kilograms. Every panel was built from high-tensile steel and assembled from flat diagonal and vertical members bolted together in a rigid lattice. The design balanced strength and weight so efficiently that it could carry loads many times greater than its own mass. The panels were the heart of the system, but they were only one of many standardized components. Transoms, Horizontal steel beams about 6 feet long connected the trusses on each side, forming the framework for the bridge's floor. On top of the transoms lay stringers, narrower beams that distributed the load evenly along the deck. Finally came the wooden decking, made of thick planks or chesses, often laid double for heavy-duty spans. When combined, these layers created a platform that could carry everything from infantry and jeeps to 40-ton Sherman tanks. The entire structure was held together with pins and clamps rather than bolts, allowing rapid assembly and disassembly even under fire or in darkness. The construction process followed a disciplined rhythm refined through training and battlefield experience. First, engineers built the bridge on the near bank, one section at a time, supported on rollers so that the growing structure could be pushed forward as it extended across the gap. The system was known as launching. Soldiers added panels, transoms, and decking in sequence while the far end of the bridge rested on a temporary nose, an extended light truss that acted as a cantilever to reach the opposite bank. Once the nose touched down, the entire span was rolled forward into place and the nose removed. The method eliminated the need for scaffolding or cranes, making it ideal for combat zones where time and resources were scarce. Every detail of the Bailey system was engineered for flexibility. The panels could be arranged in single, double, or triple truss configurations depending on the span length and load class. Short crossings for infantry might use a single-story bridge, while long or heavy spans could be reinforced vertically or laterally by stacking additional panels. The standard single-single configuration could support up to 20 tons, a double-double up to 40, and the more complex triple-triple configuration could handle tanks of 70 tons or more. Despite this range of strength, all configurations used the same parts, simply multiplied or layered as needed. This universality made logistics remarkably simple. Every Bailey component was interchangeable across all theaters of war. Transport was another element of its brilliance. A complete 80-foot Bailey bridge could be carried on 2 or 3 3-ton Army trucks. The parts were small enough to fit into narrow roads or jungle paths where heavier equipment could not pass. When vehicles became useless, soldiers attached carrying bars to the truss openings and moved the panels by hand. 6 men could lift and carry a panel over short distances, while larger groups organized chain formations to move components quickly from the truck depot to the riverbank. In jungle conditions, this human transport was often the only option, and photographs from Burma and Italy show teams of engineers walking through mud, each bearing a panel on their shoulders. Assembly time varied with terrain and training but was astonishingly short compared to any previous system. A well-drilled platoon could complete a 60-foot Class 40 bridge in less than 6 hours. Under fire, units often worked through the night, illuminated only by covered lamps or moonlight. The process required coordination and physical endurance rather than complex mechanics. Soldiers memorized each step of the sequence: panel, transom, sway brace, stringer, deck plank, until construction became almost instinctive. The bridge's design also accommodated improvisation. Engineers could mount it on floating pontoons to form a temporary water bridge, place it on trestles to span ravines, or use it as a ramp for ferry operations. Its ability to adapt to different situations made it invaluable in every environment, from the snow of Italy's mountains to the humid valleys of Assam. It was also remarkably durable. Some wartime Bailey bridges, assembled in haste, continued to carry civilian traffic for decades after the war ended. The process of building a Bailey bridge was more than a technical operation, it was an act of synchronization between human strength and mechanical precision. Every movement, from the lifting of a panel to the pinning of the last transom, represented the essence of wartime engineering: simplicity, efficiency, and resilience. The soldiers who carried and assembled these bridges were not merely builders. They were enablers of movement, turning static battle lines into pathways of advance. Each completed span was a silent victory over terrain and circumstance, proof that in the midst of destruction, order and ingenuity could still create connection. The real test of the Bailey Bridge and other portable crossing systems came not in laboratories or training grounds, but in the unforgiving chaos of combat. From the jungles of Burma to the volcanic terrain of the Philippines and the swamps of New Guinea, engineers faced conditions that no textbook could have fully prepared them for. The humid air corroded metal within weeks, the rain turned ground into quicksand, and every crossing attempt risked enemy fire from hidden positions across the river. Yet it was under these extreme conditions that the ingenuity of Allied military engineering proved itself indispensable. In Burma, where the terrain was defined by steep ridges, fast-flowing streams, and relentless monsoon weather, the Royal Engineers and Indian sappers first demonstrated how Bailey bridges could be adapted to jungle warfare. The 1943–1944 Chindit operations, deep penetration raids behind Japanese lines organized by Major General Ord Wingate, depended entirely on human mobility. Traditional supply routes were impossible. All equipment had to be carried by men, mules, or airdropped by Dakota transport planes. Engineers assigned to these units brought with them light assault bridging equipment, kapuk floats, folding boats, rope spans, and portable decking sections. They improvised constantly, using bamboo and salvaged materials when necessary. These lightweight footbridges allowed columns to cross creeks and flooded gullies in minutes, ensuring that the Chindits could move silently and unpredictably through enemy-held territory. Meanwhile, in the main Allied offensives along the Burma Road and the Arakan coast, heavier bridging operations were conducted to support vehicles and artillery. Here, the Bailey Bridge came into its own. The 58th and 70th Field Companies of the Royal Engineers, along with the Indian Pioneer Corps, built Bailey spans under some of the harshest conditions of the war. Teams hauled steel panels through dense vegetation and waist-deep mud, assembling entire bridges under torrential rain. The modular design allowed them to work even without vehicles. Soldiers formed human chains to carry the panels from depots to riverbanks. In several instances, bridges were built while under Japanese artillery or mortar fire, their construction concealed by smoke or the noise of rain. Despite the lack of heavy equipment, the engineers routinely completed Class 40 Bailey bridges strong enough to support Stuart and Lee tanks, as well as supply convoys vital to the Allied advance into central Burma. In New Guinea, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers faced a landscape just as punishing. Rivers such as the Markham, Ramu, and Driniamore cut through jungle valleys, flooding unpredictably after every tropical downpour. The 91st and 43rd Engineer Battalions adapted both American footbridges and British Bailey components for the Pacific environment. They combined lightweight aluminum pontoons with Bailey trusses to create hybrid bridges that could be carried in sections through the jungle and launched from makeshift wooden rollers. The humid climate rotted wooden timbers within weeks, so engineers treated decking with oil or tar to prolong its life. Bailey spans proved especially valuable in the Markham Valley advance of late 1943, where bridges had to be built faster than the Japanese could demolish them. The Philippines campaign of 1944 to 1945 provided further proof of the Bailey's versatility. When U.S. forces landed on Leyte and Luzon, they encountered terrain fractured by rivers and rice paddies. Local bridges had been destroyed during the Japanese retreat. Engineer regiments, including the 1058th and 1135th Combat Engineer Groups, relied heavily on Bailey sets shipped from Australia. The bridges were used not only for military convoys but also for civilian evacuation routes and humanitarian supply lines. Reports from Leyte describe engineers completing 80-foot spans within a single night, using lanterns covered with cloth to hide their work from Japanese aircraft. By dawn, the first jeeps and artillery pieces were already crossing. Everywhere the Bailey appeared, it altered the rhythm of war. Previously, an army might have needed days to ford a river. Now, it could do so in hours. In the dense jungles and mountain valleys of Asia, this speed meant survival. Commanders began to treat Bailey bridges as extensions of the troops themselves, mobile arteries of progress. They could be dismantled, moved forward, and rebuilt again, forming a chain of steel and wood that followed the advancing front. The bridge's reliability under fire made it legendary among soldiers. Its structure endured shelling, explosions, and floods. In Burma, one bridge was reportedly swept half off its foundations during a flash flood yet remained intact enough for repair within a day. In the Philippines, another Bailey was bombed by Japanese aircraft and still supported traffic after minimal reinforcement. These stories circulated widely, cementing the bridge's reputation as an indestructible piece of field engineering. The true measure of the Bailey's success in combat was not just the number of bridges built, though by 1945, more than 2,000 had been erected in the Southeast Asian and Pacific theaters, but the strategic flexibility it provided. It gave generals the confidence to plan operations across impossible terrain, knowing that rivers and ravines no longer dictated the pace of movement. In jungles that swallowed machines and roads alike, 6 men carrying a steel panel on their shoulders embodied a new kind of warfare, one where ingenuity and endurance outweighed brute force. The Bailey Bridge had not only survived the test of battle, it had redefined the very concept of mobility in modern war. By the end of the Second World War, the Bailey Bridge had become one of the most widely used and influential engineering inventions in military history. Its simplicity, modularity, and reliability had turned it into a universal tool for every Allied army, from the muddy plains of Normandy to the jungles of Burma. What began as a British wartime necessity quickly grew into an international standard of field engineering. The bridge's impact extended far beyond any single campaign. It reshaped how nations thought about movement, logistics, and the relationship between design and adaptability. The Bailey Bridge's success lay in its perfect balance between strength and transportability. During the war, the British and Commonwealth forces built more than 2,000 of them across Europe, Africa, and Asia. In Italy, the Royal Engineers used Bailey spans to rebuild roads through the Apennines, replacing stone bridges destroyed by retreating German forces. In France, after D-Day, American and Canadian engineers employed thousands of panels to cross rivers like the Orne, the Seine, and the Rhine, keeping the Allied advance continuous even when German demolition teams had obliterated every existing structure. The speed of these crossings astonished military observers. A Bailey Bridge could be completed in hours where older systems would have required days. It allowed generals to plan offensives without waiting for the weather or terrain to cooperate. In the east, Bailey bridges became vital to operations along the Lido Road, the critical supply route connecting India to China through Burma. The United States Army engineers working under General Lewis Pick and British Royal Engineers together relied heavily on Bailey components to span gorges and rivers in terrain previously thought impassable. The Lido Road alone required more than 70 Bailey bridges, some exceeding 200 feet in length, carried into position by hand or trucked in sections through miles of jungle. These bridges allowed convoys to deliver supplies to Chinese forces fighting the Japanese, proving that a standardized British design could become the backbone of Allied cooperation across continents. As the war drew to a close, the Bailey Bridge had earned a reputation as the engineering symbol of Allied ingenuity. When Winston Churchill described it as a war-winning device, he was not exaggerating. Its influence extended immediately into post-war military doctrine. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formed in 1949, adopted the Bailey as the template for standardized bridging systems across its member armies. Britain, Canada, and the United States continued to produce and refine the design, developing lighter aluminum versions and wider load classes for post-war vehicles. Variants such as the British Medium Girder Bridge, MGB, and the American Bailey M2 introduced in the 1950s retained the same principles of modularity and hand assembly but incorporated new materials and easier connection methods. The original rule, that 6 men could carry and assemble a standard panel, remained central to all these evolutions. The Bailey's influence extended beyond military applications. In the devastated landscapes of post-war Europe and Asia, where infrastructure lay in ruins, engineers used surplus Bailey components to reconnect towns, restore trade routes, and rebuild civilian life. Many of these, temporary, bridges became permanent fixtures. In Italy, France, India, and Burma, Bailey bridges continued to carry civilian traffic decades after the war ended. Their durability surprised even their creators. Municipal engineers found that, with minimal maintenance, the steel trusses could endure for generations. To this day, dozens of Bailey bridges remain in use in rural regions of South Asia and Africa, bearing silent testimony to their wartime origin. Civil defense and disaster relief organizations also embraced the Bailey concept. Its quick assembly and modularity made it ideal for emergency response. When floods, earthquakes, or landslides destroyed local bridges, military engineers or rescue units could deploy Bailey spans to restore access within hours. From Britain's severe flooding in the 1950s to modern relief operations in Nepal and Pakistan, Bailey and its descendants have continued to save lives by re-establishing vital connections. The same principle that once allowed an army to advance now allowed aid to reach isolated communities. The bridge's reach was not merely physical but educational. Military academies and engineering schools around the world began teaching the Bailey as a case study in practical design. It demonstrated that true innovation was not always a matter of complexity but of intelligent simplification. The idea that a structure could be both strong and portable influenced later generations of field engineering equipment, from mobile hospital platforms to temporary airstrips. By the mid-20th century, the Bailey Bridge had transcended its wartime origin to become a symbol of universal functionality. Its panels, carried by 6 men through mud and rain, represented a shift in how modern engineering viewed mobility and cooperation. It proved that the greatest achievements of wartime science were not always weapons of destruction, but tools that reconnected the broken world. Long after the guns fell silent, the Bailey Bridge continued to fulfill its purpose, not as an instrument of war, but as a bridge between necessity and human resilience. The legacy of the Bailey Bridge endured long after the war that created it had ended. It became not only an icon of wartime engineering but a lasting symbol of how simplicity, adaptability, and human ingenuity could outlive the circumstances that demanded them. Across the world, thousands of Bailey bridges continued to serve, their steel panels weathered by time but still carrying the weight of vehicles, people, and history. For the engineers who built them, and for generations that followed, the Bailey Bridge was more than a military invention. It was proof that necessity could produce designs of timeless relevance. In the years following 1945, surplus Bailey components were distributed widely through reconstruction efforts in Europe and Asia. Countries devastated by war used them to reconnect communities and reopen trade routes. In Italy, Bailey spans replaced hundreds of stone and masonry bridges destroyed by retreating German forces. Many of these, temporary, structures remained in continuous use well into the late 20th century, quietly supporting civilian life long after their original purpose had faded. In Burma, India, and the mountainous regions of Nepal, Bailey bridges became part of the permanent landscape, used by farmers, schoolchildren, and travelers. Some were repainted and maintained by local authorities, their origins as instruments of war largely forgotten. The enduring nature of the Bailey Bridge lay in its design. Its modular steel panels resisted corrosion when properly maintained, and its truss geometry distributed stress evenly across every joint. Unlike conventional bridges, it required no specialized foundation or machinery to repair. Damaged sections could simply be replaced by new panels. This made it ideal for countries with limited industrial capacity or difficult terrain. In India, the Border Roads Organization continued to use Bailey-type bridges for remote Himalayan routes decades after independence. In Africa and Southeast Asia, humanitarian and development agencies used the same wartime designs to build access roads and emergency crossings in flood-prone regions. Preservation of Bailey bridges also became part of cultural memory. The Royal Engineers Museum in Chatham, England, displayed full-scale Bailey spans as a tribute to the Corps' wartime contributions. In Canada, the Canadian War Museum and several regional engineering institutions preserved original panels and instructional materials, illustrating how Canadian factories had mass-produced thousands of sections during the war. In the United States, examples could be found in the U.S. Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, where training displays continued to use Bailey components to teach principles of field engineering. Each preserved bridge represented a piece of functional heritage, a structure that had helped shape the modern discipline of military and civil engineering alike. The Bailey Bridge also left an intellectual and educational legacy. Its modular principles influenced the development of later engineering systems, prefabricated housing, modular scaffolding, and rapid deployment construction kits all drew inspiration from its efficiency. The post-war boom in emergency infrastructure, temporary hospitals, field airports, and relief shelters, borrowed the same philosophy of transportable sections that could be assembled by small teams without heavy tools. In a sense, the Bailey Bridge became the foundation for a new way of thinking about engineering as a flexible, portable craft rather than a fixed industrial process. Even in the 21st century, the legacy remained visible. Modern armies still use the Bailey's descendants, the medium girder bridge, MGB, and the improved ribbon bridge, IRB, which retained the same spirit of modularity and manual assembly. In disaster zones from Pakistan to Peru, aid agencies continued to deploy Bailey sets to restore access after floods and earthquakes. The bridge that once helped armies advance now served to bring medicine, food, and rescue teams to isolated regions. Its role had evolved from a tool of conquest into one of recovery and connection. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the Bailey Bridge's legacy was its human dimension. It stood as a reminder that engineering at its best was not about grandeur or complexity, but about empathy, the understanding of what people need to survive, move, and rebuild. The same structure that carried tanks across rivers in wartime carried children to school in peacetime. Its panels, once borne on the shoulders of soldiers, became the backbone of rural roads and lifelines for remote communities. For 20th-century engineers, the Bailey Bridge was an enduring lesson in the power of design to transcend circumstance. It demonstrated that true genius lies not in extravagance, but in universality, in creating something so efficient and adaptable that it remains useful long after its creators are gone. Every surviving Bailey Bridge, whether standing in an Indian mountain pass or preserved in a museum hall, continued to speak quietly of that legacy, that in the simplest form of steel and geometry, humanity had built not only a bridge across rivers, but a bridge across time itself. The story of the Bailey Bridge was ultimately a story about connection, about the ability of human intelligence to unite rather than destroy. It belonged to an age defined by total war, yet it represented the opposite impulse, the instinct to build, to repair, and to overcome division. In a world consumed by the machinery of destruction, the Bailey Bridge stood as a reminder that progress did not always mean greater power, but greater cooperation. It embodied the quiet truth that even amidst the most violent conflicts, the essence of civilization persisted in the hands of those who created rather than those who conquered. War had always been an arena of paradox. It demanded the breaking of things, roads, bridges, cities, only to demand their rebuilding moments later. The Bailey Bridge existed within that contradiction. It was conceived as a weapon of mobility, yet it carried a moral weight far beyond its steel trusses. Every panel lifted by 6 men symbolized not just a feat of engineering, but a moment of shared endurance. These soldiers, covered in mud and rain, carrying the weight of war on their shoulders, turned fragments of steel into pathways across chaos. The act itself was profoundly human. It transformed separation into connection, fear into movement, and uncertainty into direction. The bridge also redefined the meaning of strength. In an era that worshipped machines, tanks, bombers, and ships, the Bailey Bridge was built for human hands. Its genius lay not in its scale, but in its accessibility. It asked for no factory cranes or complex tools, only cooperation, rhythm, and trust among the builders. It was a structure that could be carried by 6 men, and yet could carry armies in return. In that inversion lay a quiet philosophy of resilience, that true power was not about domination, but about the ability to adapt, to endure, and to help others cross what once seemed impassable. For the engineers and soldiers who assembled it, the bridge was not merely steel and bolts, it was purpose made tangible. Each crossing built under fire or rain was an act of defiance against chaos, a statement that logic and design could impose order on a disordered world. The men who constructed these spans were not only builders of bridges, they were builders of continuity. They restored movement where it had been halted, faith where it had been broken, and connection where isolation had taken hold. In the jungles of Burma, on the rivers of France, or in the ruins of Italy, the Bailey Bridge became a metaphor for human persistence. Its legacy endured because it reflected a universal truth, that progress and compassion are not opposites. The bridge was designed for war but served peace for decades afterward. It carried food, medicine, and civilians long after it had carried soldiers and tanks. In this transformation lay its deepest symbolism. What had once been built to sustain destruction ended by sustaining life. It proved that technology, when guided by empathy, could transcend the purposes of its creation. Looking back, the Bailey Bridge captured the essence of 20th century humanity, a century torn between invention and ruin, but still capable of building something lasting. It was a product of urgency, yet it embodied patience. It was born of necessity, yet it spoke of hope. The bridge's continued presence, standing quietly in mountain valleys and rural towns, reminded later generations that engineering was never only about solving mechanical problems. It was about understanding the human condition, the need to connect, to reach the other side, and to ensure that movement never ceased, even when the world stood still. In the end, the story of the Bailey Bridge was not about metal or war at all. It was about people, about the minds that designed it, the hands that carried it, and the collective will that turned it from an object into an idea. It proved that even in humanity's darkest moments, there remained a spark of reason and cooperation capable of bridging not only rivers, but divides of every kind. In that sense, the Bailey Bridge became more than a triumph of engineering. It became a quiet monument to the enduring belief that civilization advances not through conquest, but through the simple, determined act of building a way forward together.